Cigarette smoke and old money usually covered the smell of what Dante Corsetti actually did for a living. He owned the ports, the politicians, and the silence of every man who knew better than to speak his name above a whisper. He came to a forgettable street on a gray Tuesday morning to complete a 30-second money drop, but a small cafe with a cracked wooden sign and steamed-up windows quietly destroyed the next 10 years of his life. The morning had the kind of cold that does not announce itself. It simply settles into the bones of the city and refuses to leave. Tarkau Street in the old quarter of Bucharest was narrow and largely unremarkable. Cobblestones worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, iron balconies overhead trailing dead ivy, and a row of small businesses that had survived 4 different governments by keeping their heads down and their shutters open. A black Mercedes sat idling at the far end of the street, its engine a low, patient hum. 2 more vehicles were parked behind it, their occupants watching the surrounding windows with the particular stillness of men paid to notice things other people miss. Dante Corsetti stepped out of the rear door of the Mercedes. He was 41 years old, though nothing about him suggested a man who had aged in any conventional sense. He was built like someone who had absorbed a great deal of violence over the years and found it largely agreeable. His black suit was tailored and unadorned, his dark hair pushed back from a face that carried the kind of composed, unreadable expression that takes years of practice or years of damage, sometimes both. Visible at the collar and along both hands were tattoos that did not belong to any design trend. They were the kind a man earns, not requests. He had taken command of the Corsetti network at 34, after the previous leadership had what the newspapers politely called a leadership transition and what everyone in 6 countries called a massacre. Since then, not a single cargo container moved through the Eastern Corridor without his knowledge, not a single border official stayed bought without his approval, and not a single person who worked for him confused his calm for kindness. Walking half a step behind him was Gregor Szabo, his operations director, a broad, economical man who communicated mostly in short sentences and the occasional raised eyebrow. Gregor was holding a phone to his ear, relaying something in a low voice about a delayed shipment out of Constanta. Vassal's contact says the hold is a customs issue, Gregor said, lowering the phone. It isn't, Dante replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that does not need volume to be heard. It's Vassal's contact saying whatever keeps his name off the paperwork for another 48 hours. Call Draghasai. Tell him the delay costs double on Thursday. Gregor nodded once and stepped back toward the vehicles. The money drop itself was already arranged. A bakery at number 14, 3rd door on the left, a brown envelope passed through a side window to a man named Floresu who would hand it upward through 3 layers of legitimate business before it became untraceable. Dante had done it a dozen times on streets exactly like this one. It took less time than ordering a meal. He turned left. The 3rd door on the left was not a bakery. That much was immediately clear. The sign above it, hand-lettered in faded dark paint on a pale wooden board, read simply Vassal and Few, which translated roughly to Vassal and Son. Below the name, someone had added in smaller letters, Café, Mike DeJun, Buna Dispositi, coffee, breakfast, good spirits. Dante stopped. He looked at the door, then at the building numbers above it. He had the right street, wrong building. Floresu's bakery was next door, separated by a sliver of alley barely wide enough to pass through sideways. He should have turned around immediately. He had a shipment problem, a Tuesday schedule, and exactly 0 reason to push open a stranger's cafe door at 8:30 in the morning. He pushed it open anyway. The warmth hit him first. Not the aggressive, overheated warmth of a building compensating for broken insulation, but the kind that comes from a kitchen that has been running since before sunrise, real heat, earned heat, carrying with it the smell of dark-roasted coffee, something buttery cooling on a rack, and the faint sweetness of cardamom. After the gray, damp cold of the street, it was an almost aggressive comfort. The cafe was small, no more than 10 tables, with exposed brick walls, mismatched wooden chairs, and pendant lights hanging at uneven heights from the low ceiling. A long counter ran along the right side, behind which an old brass espresso machine stood like a piece of furniture that had been there since before the building was built. Every table was occupied. A low, warm noise of morning conversation filled the room, spoons on saucers, a newspaper folding, someone laughing at something on the far side. Nobody looked up when Dante walked in, which was, in itself, unusual. People always looked up when Dante walked into a room. Whether they knew exactly who he was or simply registered something in the way he moved, they looked. It was a reliable, consistent fact of his adult life. Not here. He stood just inside the doorway, hand still on the door, and he lifted his sunglasses slightly, as though correcting for a trick of the light. She came from behind the counter carrying a tray in both hands, a large cup of coffee, a glass of water, a small plate of something warm moving between tables with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly where everything was and had never needed to rush to prove it. She was perhaps 28 or 29. Dark hair pulled loosely back from her face, a few strands falling free at her jaw. She wore the cafe's plain apron over a white t-shirt, and she was speaking to one of the seated customers, something short and apparently funny, because the old man she was serving laughed and shook his head. She did not look like someone performing warmth for tips. She looked like someone who actually had some to spare, which, in Dante's experience, was considerably rarer. She turned from the table, tray tucked under one arm now, and her eyes moved to the doorway. She saw him, and she did not do what people usually did. She did not go still. She did not look away quickly. She did not produce the cautious, placating smile that Dante had come to recognize as the universal human response to his presence in a room. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at a stranger who has just walked through their door on a cold morning, with open, uncalculated curiosity, the kind that does not yet know it has anything to be afraid of. "Close the door," she said, her voice unhurried and entirely unbothered. "You're letting the cold in." Dante closed the door. Something moved inside his chest that had no business being there. It was not a sensation he recognized, and he was a man who prided himself on recognizing everything. He stood there for a moment, sunglasses raised, the most feared name in 4 countries, waiting to be told where to sit. He stayed for 47 minutes. He ordered 1 coffee. He did not conduct the money drop until the following day because he could not, for reasons he refused to examine, make himself leave. The penthouse on Calia Victoria did not feel like a home because Dante had never needed it to. It was a place with a bed, a desk, and a view of a city that belonged to him in every way that mattered and in no way that showed. The furniture was dark and chosen by someone else. The kitchen had never produced a meal. The only light burning at 6 in the morning was the one above his desk, and that was less about ambience and more about the fact that the work did not wait for sunrise. Gregor was already in the chair across from him, tablet in hand, reading from the morning's movement report with the flat efficiency of a man who understood that Dante did not need context, commentary, or good morning. "Constanto is still sitting," Gregor said. "3rd day now." "Then it isn't a logistics problem," Dante said, without looking up. "Logistics problems move. This one is sitting still because someone needs it too. Find out who benefits from it staying where it is and start the conversation from there." Gregor typed something and continued. "Floresu drop is confirmed for Tuesday. Tarkow Street, number 14. The bakery, 3rd door from the north end of the street." "Who walked it?" "Luca." Dante looked up, not with concern, just with the quiet, particular stillness of a man making a note against a name. He held Gregor's eye for exactly 1 second, then returned to the page in front of him. Fine. What Dante had built over 7 years was not, in any dramatic sense, an empire. There were no late-night gatherings around long tables, no ceremony. No speeches about loyalty delivered to rooms full of armed men. What there was instead was a system, and systems, maintained correctly, did not require drama. Shipping contracts and border relationships, transport companies with clean registrations, port officials who received a quarterly deposit and understood implicitly that it came with a single condition: silence. He had inherited the network running on intimidation and converted it, piece by piece, into something that ran on dependency. Frightened men made mistakes. Dependent men made sure they didn't. He was not liked. He was not supposed to be. He was the fixed point around which everything else calculated its position, and that arrangement had served him without interruption for the better part of a decade. His phone produced 4 messages before 7 in the morning. 2 were from border contacts. One was from a transport lawyer in Vienna, and one was from a number he did not recognize, which Gregor would run before noon, and which would almost certainly turn out to be either an approach from a new official looking for supplemental income or a wrong number. In his experience, the distinction between the two was sometimes surprisingly thin. By 8 o'clock, he had resolved 3 of the 4 matters, changed his shirt, and was in the back of the Mercedes moving through the gray, unhurried traffic of a Bucharest Tuesday. The city outside, the tinted window, looked exactly as it always did at this hour. Heavy skis, wet pavements, people moving with their shoulders up against the cold that had arrived 2 weeks ago and clearly intended to stay. "Tarko Street," Dante said. His driver nodded and said nothing. Drivers in Dante's employment learned early that conversation was not part of the arrangement. The Florescu drop was, by any measurement, a minor errand. The sum involved was significant enough that Dante preferred to be present, but the mechanics were simple. An envelope passed through a bakery window to Florescu, who would move it upward through 3 layers of clean business before it became indistinguishable from legitimate income. Dante had stood at windows exactly like it on streets exactly like this one, completed exactly this transaction, more times than he could recall. It was the kind of task that required almost nothing of him except his presence, which was itself the point. The Mercedes pulled to the north end of Tarkow Street and stopped. Dante stepped out. The cold settled against his face immediately, the kind that carries the particular damp weight of a city built on a river. He straightened his jacket, checked the far end of the street out of habit, and started walking. The street was narrow, cobblestoned, the kind of old quarter block that had survived successive waves of demolition and redevelopment by being too narrow and too unremarkable to bother with. Small businesses ran the length of it on both sides. A tailor, a pharmacy with a handwritten sign in the window, a man selling newspapers from a folding table with the resigned patience of someone who had been doing it for 30 years and fully intended to do it for 30 more. Dante counted the doors from the north end. 1, 2, third door on the left. He pushed it open and walked through. The warmth hit him immediately, and with it the smell, dark coffee, something baked, the low, settled heat of a kitchen that had been running since well before he was awake. He took 2 full steps inside before he registered that the room in front of him had tables in it, and people at the tables, and a brass espresso machine behind a wooden counter, and no bread racks, no flour dusting the floor, no Florescu. He stopped. He looked at the door number through the glass. 14. He looked to his right. The building next door was Florescu's bakery. He could see the bread in the window from where he stood. The numbers ran south to north, which meant Luca had started counting from the wrong end of the street, which meant the third door from the north was not the bakery at all. It was this. He stood there for a moment in the warmth, in the smell of the coffee, in the unremarkable morning noise of a small café going about its business, and he turned back toward the door. And that was the moment she told him to close it. He closed the door. It was not something Dante Corsetti did follow instructions issued to him by strangers in doorways. And yet his hand moved before his thinking caught up with it, and the door clicked shut behind him, and the warmth of the room closed around him like something that had been waiting. She had already moved on. She was behind the counter now, her back to him, working the brass espresso machine with the practiced ease of someone who had long stopped thinking about the steps involved. The machine hissed. The smell deepened. Around him, the morning crowd continued its low, comfortable noise, spoons, conversation, a chair scraping back as a man by the window stood to leave. Dante stood at the entrance and looked at the room. Every table was taken. 3 people at the counter, 2 stools occupied, one on the far left sitting empty with a coffee ring on it that had not yet been wiped down. He looked at it, then at her, and waited. She turned from the machine, set a cup in front of the man at the center stool, and looked up. Her eyes moved to Dante with the same unhurried directness as before, taking him in without any visible adjustment. "Counter's free on the left," she said, nodding toward the empty stool. "Unless you're waiting for something specific." "I'm not waiting for anything," Dante said. "Then sit down." He sat down. She wiped the coffee ring from the counter in front of him with a single, efficient pass of a cloth, then turned back to the machine. "What do you want?" "Coffee." "Everyone in here wants coffee," she said, without turning around. "Black, or do you need a moment?" "Black." She pulled the shot without ceremony, set the cup in front of him, and moved to the far end of the counter where a woman was flagging her down about something involving the bill. Dante watched her go. She handled the billing question quickly and without fuss, the way she handled everything, as though complications were simply information to be processed and moved past. He picked up the cup and drank. It was exceptional. Not in any elaborate sense, there was nothing theatrical about it, no particular presentation, no small card explaining the origin of the beans. It was simply made correctly, by someone who knew what correctly meant and applied it without needing to be noticed for it. He set the cup down and looked around the room properly for the first time. The cafe was the kind of place that accumulated its character slowly, over years. The exposed brick walls carrying old stains that had become part of the texture. The pendant lights hanging at heights that suggested they had been adjusted repeatedly, until someone gave up and left them where they were. A small chalkboard above the counter listed the day's food in handwriting that was quick and readable and entirely without flourish. She came back and refilled the cup of the man 2 stools down without being asked. The man didn't look up from his newspaper. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. "You're not from this street," she said, not to anyone in particular, though the man with the newspaper was clearly a regular and clearly not who she was addressing. "No," Dante said. "Tourist?" "No." She looked at him then, a brief, assessing look, not unfriendly but not warm either. "Business, then?" "Something like that." "Wrong address?" she asked. There was no particular edge in it, just a straight observation from someone who had watched enough people walk through her door to develop an accurate read of which ones had intended to. Dante paused for exactly 1 second. "Wrong address," he confirmed. She accepted this without comment, the way a person accepts information that confirms what they already suspected, and moved on to the next task without making anything of it. There was something in that, the absence of curiosity where most people would have produced some, that caught his attention more than a question would have. "The food," Dante said, nodding toward the chalkboard. "The breakfast board, is the kitchen still running?" "Until 10, she said, already reaching for a small pad on the shelf behind her. "The eggs take 8 minutes. The pastries are from this morning, so they're good. The cheese toast is better than it sounds." "The eggs." She wrote it down, tore the slip, and clipped it to a small rail above the service window to the kitchen. The kitchen was out of sight, but clearly not out of earshot. She called something through the window in a low voice and received a short response from whoever was back there. Dante sat with his coffee and watched the room turn over. 2 tables cleared, refilled within minutes. She managed it without appearing to be managing anything, the way a current manages a river, invisibly, continuously, and with complete indifference to whether anyone noticed. She knew the regulars not just by face, but by small, specific things. An old man near the door received his second coffee without asking for it. A woman with a heavy coat got a recommendation about the soup that was coming on the lunch menu without soliciting one. The eggs arrived in 8 minutes exactly, plain and well-seasoned, on a plate that was warm. Dante ate without speaking. She did not attempt conversation. The room filled slightly, then thinned, and somewhere in that movement 47 minutes passed without him marking them. When he set the last of his money on the counter and stood, she was at the far end, her back to him, already on to the next thing. He did not say goodbye. He did not give his name. He walked out onto Tarkow Street, where the cold received him without sentiment, and stood on the pavement for a moment longer than necessary before starting back toward the Merceds. The Fleuresu drop could wait until tomorrow. He went back on Wednesday. He told himself it was because the Fleuresu drop still needed completing, which was true, and which had nothing to do with it. Floressu's bakery was next door. The drop took 40 seconds. Dante was back on Tarkow Street for 2 hours. He sat at the same stool. He ordered the same coffee. She made it without asking. On Thursday, he arrived 7 minutes earlier. On Friday, it was 10. By the following Tuesday, his driver, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Constantin who had been behind the wheel for 4 years without once offering an unsolicited opinion, had adjusted the morning route without being told, swinging the Mercedes down through the old quarter as a matter of course, pulling to the north end of Tarkow Street at 20 past 8 with the settled routine of a man who understood that his job was to arrive, not to inquire. Gregor noticed the schedule shift on the third day and said nothing. He rerouted the morning briefings to 8 o'clock instead of 8:30 and did not explain the adjustment to anyone who asked, because nobody who worked for Gregor was in a position to ask about anything that touched Dante's movements. The café received him the same way each morning, warmly, impersonally, and with complete indifference to who he was. He found this, against all reasonable expectation, enormously restful. "You're early today," Nora said on the Thursday of the second week, setting his coffee down without looking at him directly. "I had a shorter morning," Dante said. "You don't look like someone who has short mornings." "I don't look like someone who eats breakfast in a café on Tarkow Street either." She considered this briefly. "Fair point," she said, and moved on. That was, in its entirety, the longest conversation they had managed in the first 2 weeks, and Dante turned it over in the back of his mind for the remainder of the morning in a way that would have alarmed him had he been paying attention to what he was doing. The regulars noticed him before the end of the first week. There was a table of 3 older men who arrived every morning at 8:15, ordered the same things, and spent an hour dismantling whatever the day's news had produced with the comfortable ferocity of people who had been disagreeing with each other for decades, and found it mutually sustaining. They clocked Dante on day 3. He could tell by the way their conversation volume dropped fractionally when he entered, and resumed once he had settled at the counter with his back to them. By the end of the second week, they had stopped adjusting at all, which meant they had categorized him as a fixture, which was not something Dante had been called before. There was also a young woman who came in every morning with a laptop and a defeated expression, and ordered a long black and a pastry, and sat at the corner table for exactly 90 minutes before packing up with the grim determination of someone returning to a task she deeply resented. She had glanced at Dante twice in the first week, with the particular wariness of a person trying to establish whether someone in a good suit sitting alone at a café counter was interesting or concerning. By the second week, she had apparently concluded he was neither and stopped looking. The man with the newspaper, the one Nora refilled without being asked, was called Petter. Dante established this on day 6 when Nora addressed him by name while handing him a small plate of something he hadn't ordered. "You didn't ask for this," Petter said, looking at the plate. "You've been coughing since Monday," Nora said. "Eat the honey toast. It won't kill you and the alternative might." Petter muttered something unflattering about unsolicited medical advice and ate the honey toast. Dante watched this exchange from 2 stools over and said nothing. She had already moved on by the time he looked back at his cup. "You do that often?" he asked when she passed behind the counter again. "Do what?" "Feed people things they didn't order." "Only when they need it," she said without slowing down. "Most people don't ask for what they need. They ask for what they're used to." She disappeared into the kitchen before he could respond, which was, he was beginning to understand, something she did with a certain deliberateness, landing a thing squarely and then removing herself before it could be examined too closely. He stayed for 50 minutes that day. He told himself it was because the coffee was still half full. On the Friday of the second week, Constantin pulled to the north end of Tarkow Street without being asked, turned off the engine, and settled back in his seat with the patient, present stillness of a man prepared to wait for however long was required. Dante stepped out, adjusted his jacket against the cold, and started down the cobblestones toward the café. He did not run through his reasoning. He did not construct a justification. There were, he was aware, men in his employ who would find his daily presence in an unremarkable café on an unremarkable street profoundly strange. And there were men in his employ who would find it concerning for different reasons entirely, and he had no intention of discussing it with any of them. The café door was warm under his hand. Inside, the brass machine was already running, the morning crowd was already settled, and Nora was already moving between tables with her tray, unhurried and entirely unimpressed with the morning and everyone in it. She looked up when the door opened, as she always did. "Same as yesterday," she called across the room. "Same as yesterday," Dante said and sat down. Petter, 2 stools over, turned a page of his newspaper and said nothing. The 3 old men at their table resumed their argument about something in the news. The woman with the laptop stared at her screen with quiet despair. Nobody looked twice. He had never come in the evening before. It was not a decision he had planned or particularly examined. The Tuesday had run long, a complication with a Vienna lawyer that stretched a 2-hour meeting into 5, followed by a phone call with a port contact in Galati that resolved nothing and consumed another 40 minutes of his evening. By the time Konstantin pulled onto Tarkow Street, it was 7:15, and the sensible thing would have been to continue home. The cafe light was still on. He pushed the door open. The room was almost empty. 2 tables still occupied, a young couple near the window sharing a bottle of wine, an older woman by the wall nursing a tea with the deliberate slowness of someone in no hurry to return to wherever she had come from. The morning noise was entirely gone. The space felt different without it, quieter, smaller, the pendant lights a little warmer against the darkened windows. Nora was behind the counter wiping down the machine. She looked up when the door opened, and for the first time since he had been coming here, something crossed her face that was not her usual composed indifference. It was not alarm. It was closer to surprise, the specific surprise of seeing something in the wrong context, the way a person looks when they encounter a colleague outside of work and need a half-second to place them. "We stop serving food at 8, she said. "I don't need food." She looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the machine. "Sit down, then." He sat at his usual stool. She made the coffee without being asked, set it in front of him, and returned to the cleaning. The couple by the window spoke in low voices. The older woman finished her tea, gathered her coat, and left. Then it was just the 2 of them and the low sound of the city outside the glass. "Long day?" Nora asked, not looking up from the counter she was wiping. "Longer than it needed to be." "Most days are," she said. She wrung out the cloth over the small sink and draped it over the edge. "What do you do? You've never said." "Logistics," Dante said. "Import and export." She accepted this the way she accepted most things, without pressing it further, filing it somewhere and moving on. She poured herself a small glass of water and leaned against the counter across from him, and for the first time since he had been coming to the cafe she was still. Not moving to the next task, not managing the room. Just standing there with her water, tired in a way she was not bothering to conceal. "You look like you've had a long day as well," Dante said. "My brother was supposed to come in this morning," she said. "He didn't." She said it simply, without apparent drama, but there was something underneath the simplicity that Dante recognized, the particular flatness of a person delivering a fact they have had to deliver enough times that they have worn the emotion out of it. "Does that happen often?" he asked. Nora turned the glass slowly in her hand. "More lately." She was quiet for a moment. "Mihai is 23. He's a good person. He's the kind of person who helps strangers carry things upstairs and remembers everyone's birthday and means every word he says." She paused. "He's also been keeping company with people I don't know, coming home at hours that don't make sense, and jumping at sounds that would not have bothered him a year ago." "Have you asked him about it?" "He says it's nothing." Her jaw tightened, barely. "He says it the way people say things are nothing when they are something they don't want you to be part of." The couple by the window gathered their things and left, the door closing gently behind them. The cafe was empty now except for the 2 of them and the quiet. "There are debts," Nora said after a moment. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the counter, or through it, at something that lived a considerable distance behind her eyes. I don't know the full shape of them. He hasn't told me the numbers, and I haven't pushed because I think if I hear the numbers, I will not be able to pretend they are manageable. She stopped. He started working for someone about 8 months ago. He told me it was courier work. European routes, packages, straightforward. She paused again. He lost 12 kilos in 6 months. Mihai has never been thin. Dante's expression did not change. He was very good at that, keeping his face arranged in the particular neutral that gave nothing away and asked for nothing in return. What he could not control was his hands, which had been resting loosely on the counter and had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, gone completely still. "Have you spoken to anyone about it?" he asked. "Police." Nora looked at him then, with the quiet, measuring look of someone deciding how much to say. "The kind of people Mihai is involved with," she said carefully, "are not the kind of people who become less dangerous when you speak to the police." Dante said nothing. She straightened up from the counter, picked up his empty cup, and turned toward the sink. "I'm sure it'll sort itself," she said. The tone had changed, lighter, closed. The door she had opened briefly now pulled shut again. "He's young. Young men make bad decisions and survive them." "Sometimes," Dante said quietly. She turned on the tap. "Same time tomorrow." "Same time tomorrow," he said and stood. He left 2 notes on the counter and walked out onto Tarkow Street, where Konstantin was waiting with the engine running. He got into the back of the Mercedes and sat in the dark for a long moment. "Home, boss?" Konstantin asked. "Give me a minute," Dante said. Konstantin gave him the minute without a word. He did not go home. He told Konstantin to take him to the warehouse office on Splail Independente instead, a building that appeared on no company registration connected to Dante's name, that received no visitors who had not been cleared twice, and that contained, among other things, a filing system that the Romanian federal authorities had been trying to locate for 3 years without success. It was past 9 by the time he arrived. The building was largely dark. A single man sat at the ground floor entrance, stood when Dante walked in, and said nothing. Dante took the stairs to the 2nd floor, unlocked the corner office, and sat down at the desk. He called Gregor. "Eastern Corridor Assets," Dante said when the call connected. "Romanian nationals, recruited in the last 12 months. Send me the file." A pause. "All of them." "All of them." The file arrived on his encrypted terminal 11 minutes later. Dante opened it and began reading. The Eastern Corridor was Radu Milya's operational territory, Radu being Dante's second-in-command, a meticulous and utterly humorless man from Cluj who had been with the network since before Dante took over, and who ran his section of it with the kind of cold, procedural efficiency that produced excellent results and absolutely no warmth whatsoever. Dante trusted his competence completely. He had never been entirely comfortable with his judgment. The asset list ran to 19 names. Dante read through them steadily, the way he read everything, without rushing, without skipping, taking the information in at the pace it deserved. He found the name on page 4. Vasil Mihai, DOB 14 March 2001. Recruited, April current year. Handler, Pechinu declassification, active courier Eastern route. Compliance mechanism, financial leverage, secondary personal. Dante stopped. He read the entry again. Then he turned to the supplementary notes attached to the file, which were Radu's additions, brief, clinical, written in the shorthand of a man who viewed the people in his ledgers as variables rather than individuals. Subject recruited following accumulated debt to network affiliate. Initial resistance. Compliance secured after handler referenced family exposure. Sister, Vasil N., operator of small café business, Tarkow Street, identified as secondary leverage point. Subject has been cooperative since. No further incidents. Dante set the page down on the desk. The office was quiet. Outside, the city moved in its usual indifferent way, distant traffic. A siren somewhere several streets over. The low, persistent noise of a place that does not stop, because one man in one room has just read something that rearranged the interior of his chest. He sat back in the chair, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Mihai Vasil, 23 years old, the kind of person who helped strangers carry things upstairs, who had lost 12 kilos in 6 months, who came home at hours that didn't make sense and jumped at sounds that would not have bothered him a year ago, was listed on page 4 of his own network's asset register as a courier kept in line through the threat of harm to his sister. To Nora, who made coffee on Tarkow Street and fed Petter honey toast when he was coughing and had told Dante, with the particular flatness of someone who had worn the emotion out of a fact through repetition, that she suspected her brother was in trouble she couldn't name. Dante picked the page up again. Secondary leverage point. He read those 3 words several times in the silence of the office. They were Radu's words, written in Radu's hand, referring to a woman who had told a stranger to close her door on a cold Tuesday morning and had not once, in 3 weeks of daily visits, asked him for a single thing. He called Gregor again. Pechinu, Dante said. Who does he report to directly? Radu's division, Gregor said. Why? When was the last movement logged on the Vassal courier route? A pause, the sound of keys. Last Thursday, crossing at Giurgiu, packages confirmed delivered. What was in the packages? Another pause, longer this time. That's not in the summary file, boss. That's in Radu's operational logs. I'd need to go through him to pull it. Don't go through him, Dante said. Get me the logs directly, tonight. Gregor was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which, for Gregor, was the equivalent of a lengthy hesitation. Going around Radu on his own corridor will get noticed. I know, Dante said. Do you want me to? Get me the logs, Gregor. Yes, boss. Dante ended the call and sat in the quiet office with the file open on the desk in front of him. The supplementary notes were still visible. He did not read them again, because he did not need to. The relevant lines had already arranged themselves somewhere behind his eyes with the permanent, unhurried certainty of things that cannot be unread. He had been coming to the cafe for 3 weeks. He had sat at her counter, drunk her coffee, watched her manage her room with the quiet, self-possessed competence of someone who had built something honest with her own hands and intended to keep it. He had found it, against every reasonable expectation, the most bearable part of his day. And somewhere in the floors of his own operation, a man named Pechinu was using her name as a threat. Dante closed the file. He sat with it for a long time in the dark, the city moving quietly outside the window, his hands flat on the desk and entirely still. Gregor delivered the operational logs at 11:15 that night, in person, which meant he had understood the weight of the request and decided that a digital transfer was not the appropriate vehicle for it. He set the folder on the desk without comment and sat down in the chair across from Dante, which he only did when he intended to stay. Dante read through the logs in full. It took 20 minutes. When he finished, he closed the folder, set it beside the asset file, and looked at the wall for a moment in the particular way he looked at things when he was converting information into decisions. Mihai Vasil has been running sealed packages across the Giurgiu crossing for 7 months, Dante said. He does not know what is in them. Presumably not, Gregor said carefully. Pechinu told him it was documents, commercial paperwork. Dante tapped the folder. It isn't documents. Gregor said nothing. The debt that brought him in, Dante continued, originated with a loan from a network affiliate, 4,200 euros. It has since been recorded in Radu's ledger as 11,000 through fees that were applied without the subject's knowledge or agreement. He paused. The compliance note references the sister as leverage. That instruction came from Pechinu, countersigned by Radu. The office was very quiet. Radu countersigned it, Gregor said, not as a question. Radu countersigned it, Dante confirmed. Gregor exhaled slowly through his nose. He was not a man who frightened easily, but he understood the architecture of what he had just heard, and he understood what it meant that Dante was saying it aloud in this particular tone of voice at 11:15 at night. What do you need? Gregor asked. Dante opened the desk drawer and removed a single sheet of paper, on which he had already written 4 lines while Gregor was in transit. He slid it across the desk. Gregor read it. He looked up. This removes vassal from the corridor entirely. Debt discharged, record amended, handler reassigned. He paused. Radu will notice the gap in the route. I know. He'll ask questions. He can ask them, Dante said. He won't like the answers. Gregor folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. He stood, then stopped. The Pechinu matter, he said. How far does that go? Pechinu is relieved of the Eastern Corridor effective tomorrow morning, Dante said. He is to be told his services are being redirected. Nothing further. If he asks for a reason, he is to be told that reasons are not part of his arrangement. And if he goes to Radu? Dante looked at him. Then Radu will know that I am aware of what he countersigned, and he will spend the next several weeks deciding what to do about that, which will keep him occupied and out of the corridor while I restructure it. He picked up his pen. That is not an accident, Gregor. Gregor nodded once and left without further questions, which was one of the qualities Dante valued most in him. The restructuring took 4 days. It was done quietly, in the way that Dante did most things, without announcement, without confrontation, through a series of small adjustments that individually appeared administrative and collectively amounted to a surgical removal. Pechinu's access was revoked on Wednesday morning under the explanation of a corridor review. Mihai Vassal's file was pulled from the active asset register and marked closed, the debt figure corrected to its original amount, and then reduced to 0 under a notation that read affiliate error, discharged in full. The courier route was redistributed across 2 other operatives, neither of whom had any connection to the Vassal name or to Tarkow Street. On Thursday afternoon, a notarized letter was dispatched from a legal firm with no traceable connection to Dante, addressed to Mihai Vassal at his registered home address. It stated that a debt previously held by a financial affiliate had been independently reviewed, found to contain significant administrative irregularities, and had been discharged completely and without condition. It further stated that no further contact regarding the matter should be expected. Dante did not sign it. He did not need to. On Friday morning, he went to the café at the usual time and sat at the usual stool and drank his coffee, and Nora moved around the room in her usual unhurried way, and nothing about the morning indicated that anything had changed, because as far as anyone in the café was concerned, nothing had. What had changed was on the 14th floor of a building on Kalia Floriska, where Radu Milja sat at his own desk on Friday afternoon and read through a discrepancy report that his administrator had flagged that morning. He read it twice. He set it down. He pulled Pechinu's reassignment notice, read that, and set it beside the discrepancy report. He sat with both documents for a long time without moving. Then he picked up his phone and called a man named Balin, who handled certain problems that Radu preferred not to put in writing. I need you to look into something, Radu said when the call connected. Quietly, there is a cafe on Tarkow Street. He gave Balin the address. Find out why our employer has been going there every morning for a month, Radu said, and find out who works there. He ended the call and sat back in his chair, and the expression on his face was not anger, and it was not surprise. It was the settled, patient look of a man who had suspected something for several weeks and had just received the first confirmation that his suspicion was worth developing into something more deliberate. He almost did not go that evening. There had been a meeting on Kalia Floriska that ran until 7:30. A transport contractor from Plovdiv, who needed his terms renegotiated in the particular way that people renegotiate terms when they have recently remembered that the alternative to agreement is considerably worse than the agreement itself. By the time it concluded, and Konstantin pulled the Mercedes into evening traffic, Tarkow Street was 20 minutes in the wrong direction. Dante looked at his phone, then he looked at the window. Tarkow Street, he said. Konstantin adjusted the route without comment. He arrived at 8:43. The cafe closed at 9. Through the fogged glass, he could see that the room was nearly empty, one table still occupied near the back, Nora moving behind the counter with the particular efficiency of someone beginning to close down for the night. He stood on the pavement for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air, and was already reaching for the door when Constantine's voice came from behind him. "Boss." Something in the single word stopped him. Constantine was not a man who used tone unnecessarily. Dante turned. Constantine was looking down the street. 40 meters away, a dark Dacia was parked against the curb with its engine off and its lights out, which on an otherwise empty street at 8:43 in the evening was not a coincidence. Two men had just stepped out of it. They were walking toward the café with the specific, measured pace of people who had been told where to go and what to do when they got there. Dante recognized the pace before he recognized the faces. "Stay with the car," he said quietly. He turned back to the café door. The two men were perhaps 20 meters away. He had 17 seconds, approximately, before they reached the entrance. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Nora looked up from behind the counter. She opened her mouth to say something, probably that they were nearly closed, probably in that unhurried, matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, but something in his face stopped her. "The couple at the back table," Dante said, his voice low and entirely level. "Tell them the kitchen has had a problem. Get them out the back door, right now." She stared at him for exactly 1 second. It was, he noted somewhere in the back of his thinking, a measure of something about her that she did not argue, did not ask for an explanation, and did not waste the second. She set down what she was holding and crossed to the back table in 4 steps. "I'm so sorry," she said to the couple, her voice smooth and apologetic. "We've had a small gas issue in the kitchen. I need to ask you to step out through the back. There's no charge tonight. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience." The couple gathered their things with the mild, unquestioning compliance of people who have just been told there is a gas issue. And Nora moved them through the kitchen door with a firmness that suggested she was not entirely unacquainted with the management of difficult situations. The front door opened behind Dante. The two men who came through it were large and unhurried, and had the settled, impersonal demeanor of people executing a task rather than making a decision. The first one's eyes moved across the room and landed on Dante, and something in them shifted, a recalibration, the brief adjustment of a man who had expected to find a woman alone and had found something else entirely. "We're closed," Dante said. "We're not here for coffee," the first man said. He had a Cluj accent and the specific confidence of someone who believed the room was already resolved in his favor. "I know why you're here," Dante said. "The question is whether you've thought carefully about who sent you and what that tells you about how much your well-being matters to him." The first man smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Radu said you'd talk." "Radu was right," Dante said. "I am talking, I'm telling you to leave." The second man moved to the left, which was the moment Dante stopped talking. What happened in the following 40 seconds was not complicated, and it was not prolonged. Dante was not a large man in any imposing sense. He was lean and composed, and moved with the economy of someone for whom violence was not an expression of anger, but a problem to be solved with the minimum expenditure of effort. The first man reached for something at his waistband and found his wrist redirected with a force that produced a sound that ended the conversation about whatever he was reaching for. The second man covered the distance between them in 2 steps and managed one before Dante stepped inside the reach and made the distance irrelevant. The brass espresso machine sustained a small dent from the second man's shoulder on his way down. One chair toppled. A cup fell from the counter and broke cleanly on the stone floor. The whole thing lasted less time than it takes to describe. Both men were on the floor. Neither was in a condition to continue. Dante straightened his jacket. He looked at them for a moment, then at the broken cup, and then at the kitchen door, which had opened 6 inches. Nora was standing in the gap, very still, one hand on the door frame. Her eyes moved from the two men on the floor to Dante, and then back, and then to Dante again. The room was completely silent, except for the low sound of the city outside, and the faint, absurd ticking of the espresso machine cooling down for the night. "The couple," Dante asked. Out the back and gone, Nora said. Her voice was steady, just barely but steady. Dante nodded. He looked at her directly for the first time since he had walked through the door, and what he saw in her face was not the clean, uncalculated openness of the woman who had told him to close the door on a cold Tuesday morning. It was something older and more complicated than that. She knew. Not everything, but enough. She did not move from the kitchen doorway for a long moment. Then she pushed it open fully, walked to the counter, and picked up the tray that had fallen when the second man's shoulder caught the edge of it on his way down. She set it on the counter. She looked at the broken cup on the floor. She looked at the two men, who were breathing but not moving, and then she looked at Dante, and she said nothing at all. Dante crouched beside the first man, removed the phone from his jacket pocket, and handed it to Gregor via a text to Konstantin outside with a single instruction attached. Then he stood, straightened his jacket for the second time, and met her eyes. "My people will be here in 4 minutes," he said. "They will remove them. There will be nothing left for anyone to find or question." Nora nodded once. Her hands, he noticed, were not entirely still. She had them flat on the counter, pressing down slightly, in the way a person presses down on a surface when they need something solid to confirm that the room is still the room. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "I'm fine standing." "Your hands are shaking." She looked at them as though they belonged to someone else and had acted without her permission. She pulled them off the counter and held them at her sides, which did not solve the problem but clearly felt more dignified. "I said I'm fine." Dante pulled out the stool nearest to her and sat down himself, which left her the choice of standing over him or taking the stool beside him. After a moment she sat, with the careful, deliberate movement of someone ensuring they do not appear to need to. The café was very quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights briefly pressing through the fogged glass and retreating again. "Who are they?" Nora asked. "People who work for someone who has decided I have a problem," Dante said. "You were the problem they were sent to demonstrate." She absorbed this. "Because of Mihai." "Because of me," Dante said. "Mihai is already clear. The debt is gone. The file is closed. He will receive a letter if he hasn't already, confirming it." She turned her head and looked at him directly. It was the first time in the conversation she had done so without something else occupying her attention, and the look was long and undecorated and entirely serious. "You did that?" "Yes." "Why?" Dante looked at the counter. It was the same counter he had sat at every morning for 5 weeks, and the question was the correct one, and he owed her an answer that was not a deflection. "Because it was my organization that put him there," he said. "And because it was wrong, and because—" He stopped. He restarted. "Because you told me about it in this room and trusted me with it, and I was already responsible for it, and I could not continue to sit at your counter every morning knowing that." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who are you?" It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as something she had already assembled most of the answer to, and was now simply presenting for confirmation. "My name is Dante Corsetti," he said. The name settled into the room the way heavy things settle, without drama, without bounce, simply arriving at the floor and staying there. Nora's expression did not collapse. It did not produce the wide, recoiling horror of someone hearing something for the first time. What it produced instead was a small, tired exhale through the nose, the specific exhale of someone receiving confirmation of a thing they had been carrying for several weeks and were not entirely sorry to set down. "I know who you are," she said. Dante looked at her. "I Googled you," she said. "On the 9th day. You came in for the 9th morning in a row and you were wearing the same watch and you ordered the same coffee and you never once looked at your phone while you were in here, which is unusual enough in a person that it makes you memorable." She paused. "I typed the name from your car registration into a search engine. Konstantin parks in the same spot every morning. The plate is not difficult to read." Dante was quiet. "There were a considerable number of results," Nora said. "There would be," he said. "I kept coming up with reasons to wait and see," she said. "You were polite. You were never anything other than polite. And Mihai was, she stopped. She looked at the counter. Mihai was getting worse, and you were the only person who sat in this cafe and looked like someone who could do something about the kind of thing I suspected he was in. She paused. I told myself I was being practical. Were you? She looked at him sideways. I told myself I was, she said. Turns out there's a difference. Constantin came through the door at that moment with two other men, both of whom moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had cleaned up after Dante before and required no instruction. Dante stood and spoke to them briefly in a low voice. They worked quickly and without noise, and within 6 minutes the room contained nothing it had not contained that morning except a dented espresso machine and a broken cup. When they were gone, the cafe was empty again and entirely still. Nora was still on the stool. She was looking at the space where the two men had been, and then she looked at Dante, and her expression carried something he had not seen on her face before, not fear, not warmth, but the careful, open look of someone standing at a threshold and taking a full measure of what lies beyond it. The man who sent them, she said, is this finished? Dante held her gaze. He wanted very much to tell her yes. Not yet, he said. Ray Dumilia was not a man who made dramatic mistakes. He was precise, methodical, and had survived 20 years in the network by understanding exactly where the boundaries of his authority ended and Dante's began. What he had miscalculated in the end was not a boundary. It was a temperature. He had read Dante's attachment to Nora as softness, and he had treated softness as an exploitable condition, and he had been wrong on both counts in ways that cost him considerably. The meeting happened on a Sunday, in the warehouse office on Splail Independente, at 6 in the morning. Radu arrived punctually, which was the last thing he did that morning that went according to his expectations. Dante had Gregor present, and a lawyer, and a documented record of every decision Radu had made in the Eastern Corridor over the preceding 14 months, including the countersignature on Pecinu's compliance note referencing Nora's name. Dante set the document on the desk between them and said nothing. Radu looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Dante. This is about the woman, Radu said. This is about the document, Dante said. The woman is none of your concern. She was never your concern. The fact that you made her your concern is what this meeting is about. I was protecting the corridor. You were protecting your assumption that I could be managed, Dante said. Those are different things, and I think you know that. Radu said nothing further, because there was nothing further to say that would improve his position, and Radu, whatever his flaws, understood arithmetic. He was removed from the Eastern Corridor that morning, his operational access revoked, and his network relationships transferred to Gregor's direct oversight. He was not harmed. Dante was not, despite certain reputational suggestions to the contrary, a man who resolved administrative problems with violence when paperwork produced the same result more cleanly. Radu was simply reduced, in scope, in authority, in the particular confidence that had led him to put Nora Vassel's name in a compliance document, and he accepted the reduction with the tight, contained silence of a man who had correctly assessed his remaining options. Balin, the man Radu had sent to watch Tarkow Street, was reassigned to a logistics role in Plovdiv that same week, which was either a punishment or simply geography, depending on one's feelings about Plovdiv. Mihai Vassel received his letter on the Thursday. He called Nora that evening, and Dante did not know the content of the conversation, but Nora came into the cafe the following morning with the particular expression of someone who has set down a weight they had been carrying for so long they had stopped noticing it was there. She did not mention it. She made coffee. She fed Petter his second cup without being asked. She told the woman with the laptop that the corner table by the heater was free, which it wasn't usually until 10, but she said it in the tone of someone who had decided this was a good morning to make small exceptions. Dante noticed all of it from the doorway and said nothing. He had come back the morning after the cafe incident, and the morning after that, and every morning since. He had not asked her what she had decided, because it was not a question he had the right to ask. She knew who he was. She had known for weeks. What she did with that knowledge belonged entirely to her. He arrived on the Friday morning at the usual time, and the street was the same street, cold and cobblestoned and entirely indifferent to the occasion. And the café light was on behind the fogged glass the way it always was, and Constantine parked in the usual spot and turned off the engine without being asked. Dante sat in the back of the Mercedes for a moment. Then he reached up, removed his sunglasses, and folded them into his jacket pocket. He stepped out of the car without them, which he had not done on Tarkow Street before, and walked to the café door and pushed it open. The warmth came first, as it always did. The smell of dark coffee and something from the kitchen and the low, settled noise of the morning crowd. Petter was on his stool with his newspaper. The three old men were at their table, conducting their daily argument with the vigorous commitment of people who had long since stopped trying to win and were simply enjoying the process. The woman with the laptop was in the corner with her defeated expression and her pastry. Nora was behind the counter. She looked up when the door opened, the way she always did, and she looked at him, no sunglasses, no alias, no version of himself that was easier to explain than the real one. And she held his gaze for a moment with that clear, direct, entirely unfrightened look that had stopped him in her doorway on a cold Tuesday morning, and had not, in the weeks since, lost any of its particular quality. She turned to the machine. Dante walked to the counter and sat down on the stool on the left. He set his hands flat on the worn wooden surface. He did not look at his phone. He did not look at the door. The machine ran. The smell of the coffee reached him before the cup did. Nora set it in front of him without being asked, without ceremony, without a word. She did not smile, and she did not look away. She simply set it down and met his eyes for one quiet moment, and in that moment something passed between them that neither of them had the vocabulary for and neither of them needed. She moved on to the next table. Dante picked up the cup. Around them, the café continued its morning, spoons and conversation, and the comfortable, indifferent noise of ordinary life going about its business. Petter turned a page. The old men disagreed. The woman with the laptop sighed at something on her screen. Nobody looked twice. It was, without question, the loudest thing either of them had ever said.